All right, welcome back. So today we are going to continue with our unit on logic. We should be finishing this up. I have kind of planned it out. We should be finishing this up kind of in the middle in the next week. And then we'll have our first test on logic. I hope that you guys have enjoyed this. I know that logic is something that this unit is a little bit more dry. Like, I get that. Like, when you think of philosophy, you probably don't think of things just adding up. One plus one. Like, you don't think about it in that sense. It's a little bit deeper context, more abstract ideas. But in that, we have to start somewhere. We have to start with a baseline, a foundation. And that's essentially what we're doing with logic. We're giving ourselves a starting point. But again, there are problems with logic. We're going to talk about the problems specifically with Aristotelian logic because, again, as we've spoke before, Aristotle is considered the father of logic. So the ideas and the criticisms that come and shape Aristotelian logic into modern logic are going to be criticisms of Aristotle's ways and Aristotle's ideas themselves. Okay, so we're going to look at three common problems or three of the most vocalized problems with Aristotelian logic. All right, so let's go ahead and begin. There we go. All right, so the first problem with Aristotelian logic is with this concept: syllogisms with false premises. Syllogism is, again, this argument that we made, beginning of last week. This is where we started. And I wanted to give you guys, again, a little bit of a baseline with Aristotelian logic and with kind of some of the ins and outs of it before we talk about the problems with it. I wanted you to see how, again, this is like concrete in a sense and can be very helpful and can give us some very true conclusions. But I also need you to see that there are issues with it, there are problems with it, there are shortcomings here. And so let's look at this first syllogism. So if the streets are wet, it has rained recently. This is a premise. This is the first premise. The streets are wet. That is the second premise. Okay, our conclusion, therefore, it has rained recently. Now, what we are looking at here, this first common problem with Aristotelian logic is with false premises. And obviously, you know what? A false premise is a premise that is not true. Okay. Now, it doesn't mean that it cannot. It doesn't mean that it can't be true, but it's not always true. And this is, again, another issue with the syllogisms in Aristotelian logic is that they are not they it's you can't quantify it. It's kind of all or nothing. It's absolute, and so that's where the issues come. So let's look at our kind of explanation right here. So this argument is logically valid. Like, if you go outside. I did this the other day. My wife, she is going to school to be a paramedic. She's been, she works really hard. She is an EMT for Randolph County. She works as much as she can. Finishing up school to be a paramedic. I'm really proud of her, but she has to go to school down towards like Newbern, which is about 2.5, 3 hours away, once a month, like in person to do like her own site training. She's been gone for the past couple of days. She called me. This was Monday. She called me when she got out of school, and I was at home inside. I can't remember exactly what I've been doing. I've been working on some, stuff for class, or I don't know, maybe I was just watching something on YouTube. But I walked outside to talk to her, and I realized the streets were wet. And I said, "Okay, well, I guess it must have." I said, maybe it rained." And she said, "Why you say that?" I said, "Well, the streets are, the road's wet." I said, "Or someone could have just hosed it down." And both of those could be true. But what we typically think of, see, the streets are wet, see, the road's wet. Okay, it must have rained through here. But it doesn't. It isn't always the case, or there is the opportunity, the chance that it could not be true. So let's think about it this way. So if the streets are wet, it has rained recently. Most of the time that is true, but it doesn't always have to be the time. A river could have flooded. Now, how would a river flood? Well, it has to flood with water, but so that's kind of a good question. But it doesn't necessarily have to flood through just rainwater. A fire hydrant could have exploded. Now, does that happen very often? I mean, I'm just going to be honest. I've never seen a fire hydrant explode, but I guess it could. I mean, if somebody ran their car into a fire hydrant, I imagine that there would be some issues there. I've never seen it, but I imagine that would probably wet the streets. Someone could have hosed down the street. You got, somebody that's, maybe washing their car and they spray down the road. Um, and if I look out and I see the road's wet, I assume that, again, it's rained, when in reality, it hasn't. There's something else that can, describe that. So if the streets are wet, it has rained recently. That is a false premise. That is a false premise because it is not always true. That is an assumption more than anything. And when you assume things, oh, dang, I wish I had my whiteboard. Y'all know the assumed talk. Always give the assumed talk. Always give the assumed talk. Do I want to go viral today? I guess that's kind of always like the biggest question in the back of my mind. Do I want to go viral today? No, not today. Not today. Maybe next week. We'll have the assumed talk then. But when you make assumptions, again, that the premise is true, there is some latitude for error there. Okay, so if we look at this again, if we look at this syllogism with false premises, because this is not a true premise, because it is not an absolutely true premise, it makes the conclusion very flimsy. And so now we have an issue because this conclusion can be entirely different based on, again, the reality of the situation, because this is not an absolutely true premise. And if it's not absolutely true, then we have to assume that there is some falsity within it. Okay, so this is one of the problems. You don't worry about getting caught up on all these technical terms. I just want you to know why it doesn't make sense. Okay, if you can see that again, something else could have happened instead of it raining, and you're on the right track. I have to use these terms because that's just what they're called. But this is an introductory course, and we're just trying to get you kind of to understand some of these before we really worry about the vocabulary. Okay, so don't fret about that. All right, so let's look at our next one. So, syllogisms with faulty conclusions. So here is the argument. Oh man, this got cut off at the bottom. Can I hide this? Can I hide that? I want to hide this. Yeah, I can. Oh, snap! There we go. All right, you can't. That kind of gets in the way too. All right, let's just not mess with it. There we go. All right, so let's look at this one. So all men have brains. All humans have brains. Therefore, all humans are men. Now, why is there a problem with this argument? Well, because we know that all humans aren't men. It's pretty easy to figure that out. Just look around. But this is a logically valid argument. This is logically valid, but we see that there's obviously problems with it. All men have brains. True premise. That is a true premise. All humans have brains. Again, a true premise. Therefore, all humans are men. If the conclusion follows the premise and both premises are true, then the conclusion is true. But just because this conclusion is logically valid, it does not mean that it itself is true. And that, again, is a problem with Aristotelian logic. The conclusion is false because not all humans are men. But again, how did we get this conclusion? Because the premises are not absolute. It's not absolute in the sense that it's only taking into account one type of human. All men. Now that is an absolute statement. All men and all humans. Again, that is an absolute statement, but it's not taking into account that there are other humans. So maybe we can say at the same time that this is not absolute. It only describes one type of human. and doesn't take into account that again there are women, and you could turn this around the exact same way. You could say all women have brains, all humans have brains, therefore all humans are women. Both would be faulty. Both would be false because again we know from empirical evidence this is not true. So something can be logically valid. The argument itself can be logically valid, but it can be false again because either the premises are not true, or because they are not absolute, or again because there is other aspects. So logic again is just a tool. Is just a tool, and that's what I've tried to make sure that I am kind of reinforcing to you. It is a tool. It is not the only way to discover information. It is not always the best way to transfer information or to make decisions. But logic is a tool. And just like a tool, if it's the right circumstance, the right environment, then that tool works better. And that tool may be superior. But if you're trying to, if you're at war, then a gun's going to be a very important tool to have. But if you have to dig a hole, that gun isn't really going to help you too much. So again, it is just a tool. Logic is just a tool. Now let's look at another syllogism with a faulty conclusion. This the one that the example that I've attached underneath. All carrots are orange. Some cats are orange. Therefore, some cats are carrots. Again, logically valid in the sense that, okay, yeah, all carrots are orange. Okay, some cats are orange. Yes, those are both true statements. Therefore, some cats are carrots. That is faulty. That is not true. Some cats are not carrots. I will fight you on it. Some cats are not carrots. Most cats are not. No cats are carrot. Well, I mean, I guess you can name your cat Carrot. I guess that does kind of throw a wrench in my explanation. But you get what I'm saying. If this again, don't worry about don't necessarily worry too much about the lingo. Just understand why this doesn't make sense. Okay. All right. Let's look at our last common problem with Aristotelian logic. Okay, and that is definitions and improper usage of words. You may have heard during your lifetime, like, words mean something, that you should. It's important to have a large vocabulary, that you need to read more. The reason, I'm just going to let you in on a little secret. The reason why you're always told, like, you need to read, the reason why reading's always pushed as something that, like, responsible, good people do, is because it teaches them more words. It teaches them more words and how to use them in different contexts, and it helps people become more descriptive, and it helps people be able to explain more so what's going on in their own mind, or what they're seeing, what they're feeling. It helps them be more descriptive, and thus, if they're more descriptive, they're more accurate. And this is one of the biggest things with logic, is that, okay, well, we're talking about, especially outside of mathematical logic, we're using logic as a mathematical system, but with human language. So if human language is the avenue in which we are practicing logic, again, logic itself is just the system. It is a mathematical system. And so, again, we've talked about this from day one. Your math classes are rooted in logic. Again, think about algebra. 3x plus 4 equals 20. Okay, that is a logical equation, because then you're saying, okay, if this is that, then this is this, then that must be this. I mean, it is logic. You're trying to figure out Pythagorean theorem. You're trying to figure out the degrees of a triangle. Again, a triangle is this many degrees. If this angle is this, if this angle is this, then this angle must be. It's logic. It is these syllogisms we've been talking about. But when we are using human language, we have to have the same terms, and they have to mean the same things. And so this is not only an issue when it comes to, like, different languages, I talk about this in my American history classes. Like, you want to know why there was so much conflict between the natives and the like Europeans, like early on in American civilization, or not, I shouldn't say American civilization, but what would eventually become the United States. You want to know why there was so many problems? Because there's a big language barrier, and when you don't know and cannot communicate with someone that looks completely different than you, that acts completely different than you, wears completely different things than you do, that has different items, weapons, that is so distinctly different than you. When you have again all of these uh, all these conflicting ideas. Um, you know, you are going to have issue if you cannot communicate. If you cannot communicate, our first inclination is to kind of be afraid of what we don't understand. You've heard that saying. People are afraid of what they don't understand. So these Europeans, these natives, when they're seeing the others for the first time, we talked about this in my American history class. Like, there is, like, when Columbus lands, like, there is some definite uh, you know, like, we have to go out and meet these people. But there's also some timidness, timidity. I guess that's the word, where they're standoffish, like they're scared of the Europeans, and we see this when we talk about like more modern set. I say modern settlements. I guess it's just 100 years after, but like the Jamestown settlement, the Plymouth settlement. Like, there is some issues early on because there's conflict with the natives because the Europeans are essentially assuming natives are going to kill them or bring harm to them. So language is a very large barrier when you cannot communicate effectively. But that doesn't just happen like with different languages. That can happen over different times. Like, you get someone who is 80 years old and you get someone who is 20 years old. They come from different parts of the country. You get them together and you want them to talk about something as divisive as politics. They're going to be talking in two very different ways. Slang is a big issue here because, again, like, I'm trying to think, like, back in the 90s, somebody would say, "Oh, dude, check out my car, man, it's bad," but like older folk, older generations would be like, "Well, don't you mean good?" And it's like, "Well, yeah, bad means good." Well, that's how's that? How does that work? And so logic itself is incredibly reliant upon words having distinct meanings and it's staying and not being fluid. It's staying concrete. Now let's look at this because this is the best. This is the best explanation that I can give you, at least attempt to. So again, we've talked about how logic is rooted in math, and I just talked about that again, but I want to show you a little bit more. So the reason that the basis of our gained knowledge, and what do I mean by that, is people say, if someone is trying to put someone else down and call them stupid, they'll say, "Oh, you think 2 plus 2 equals something other than 4?" Because like that is that is what we all know. Like, after you are, I don't know, in kindergarten, you know that 2 plus 2 equals 4. That's the more common saying than like 1 plus 1 equals 2. Like, why 2 plus 2 equals 4? Well, good question, but I'll tell you why this is the center of our like knowledge. That's because 2 plus 2 equals 4 is logical. It's a logical system. And so I'm going to explain this in mathematical terms, but I want you to think about this just in, um, you know, take out math and insert like different words, like insert different words that had different definitions. So in mathematical logic, 2 can only be 2. So that's like saying that, that's like saying that the word, I'm trying to think of a good example. Okay, I mean, that's like, it's almost like saying that the word, um, like, gender can only be gender. And I know that's kind of like a controversial like topic, and I'm not trying to get too deep into it. But we've seen that word of gender kind of take a different form, mean different things at different times, have different connotations surrounding it at different times. But there lies the problem, is because it changes, or because it has changed, because it continues to change. Like now we have people talking about different things using one word. We're talking about different ideas, but they use the same word to describe what they're talking about, even though they both have very different meanings depending on who's speaking. Um, this is why there is a problem with logic, because with mathematical logic, which is where logic comes from, two can only be two. It cannot be one. It cannot be three. It is two, and it is nothing else other than two. Nor can it become. It is not anything else, but it is not anything else but two, and it cannot become in the future anything but two. Two is always two. And when it is added to itself, it can only become one number. So when you take two and you add two to two, you can only get one number. You can only get four. No matter what in the world happens, no matter what time it is, no matter how many years have passed, 2 plus 2 is always going to equal 4. Always going to equal 4. Because 2 is 2. It cannot change. And then when you add 2 plus 2, again, that is always going to be 4, because it cannot change. Cannot change. It is what it is. It's the way it will be. Always will be. Each premise, and again, each premise is true. 2 is 2. This is like the law of identity we talked about. 2 is 2. And since 2 is 2 and 2 plus 2 equals 4, again, it follows that logical, each premise is true, then the conclusion is true. So when people make jokes about like, hey, you're stupid, you think 2 plus 2 equals 5, they're making jokes about you being illogical. Because again, with logic, that is the basis of our knowledge. And so when you say, hey, 2 plus 2 equals 5, that's you being illogical. Excuse me. That's you being illogical. And at least in a mathematical sense, that is illogical. It cannot be. If you Google 2 plus 2, like, seriously, I did this a little bit ago looking for this just little graphic right here. I Googled 2 plus 2, and like the most popular like question, I guess, so the most popular thing on Google was 2 plus 2 equals 5. And there's people trying to explain that. Again, this is a logical system. But as you can see, when you add a logical system, but you use words in its place, if the words don't have one distinct meaning, then you're going to run into problems. Like, again, like you can look at this in many other, like think of other words that have very different meanings, or words that have multiple meanings. It gets complicated. And this is where logic just kind of starts falling short, because if words can have, like the same, like you say the word traitor. Like I could talk about a traitor being a traitor. This is spelled differently, but again, you say it the same way. So if you're saying this just out loud, with somebody not knowing the spelling of it, they can assume two different things. You can say a traitor in terms of, I'm going to trade you this book for your sunglasses. Like, we're trading objects. But I could also call you a traitor and say, like, you turned your back on me, or, you betrayed me. The word is said the same way, but it has two completely different connotations behind it. Again, go through the dictionary. Why do we have dictionaries? Again, it brings up some good points. So these are some of the common problems with Aristotelian logic. We're going to talk next week about how Aristotelian logic has essentially been criticized and molded into what we now know as like more modern logic. Then we'll finish up, we'll have a test, and then we're going to move on to epistemology. All right, so I hope you guys have enjoyed this. Again, don't worry too much about the vocabulary here. I want you to understand the idea. If you understand the idea, the vocabulary, we can knock that out. That's easy. Okay. All right. Thank you, guys. You have a quiz tomorrow. You'll do fine on it. I'm sure you will. Hey, I'll see you later. Let's pause this.